So I'm Suzanne Souter, and I'm kind of the one who got this started, I guess. So the purpose of tonight's meeting is to review the purpose of this task force and for you all to introduce yourselves to each other and choose a chair and receive some guidance from Dan Losco, our city solicitor, about your legal responsibilities in terms of record keeping and so on. And from Mr. Athey, who's the city engineer, who's outside dealing with flat tire. And he'll review the work that's been done so far that you all will be building on. So the resolution that was passed at City Council in at the March regular meeting establishes this task force because, as probably all of you know, since you're here, we're a hot spot where sea level's rising higher and faster than most other places. And so, and the comprehensive plan, the recently established comprehensive plan, has among its goals coming up with some strategies to deal with that issue. So that's the purpose of this task force. There is work that's been done before in the past, and you're going to build on that. And that's what you'll be hearing from Mr. Athey. And there's I think you all got a copy of his summary of the previous studies and some other resources. So the goals of the task force are to review the available information about sea level rise, to prepare a prioritized list of actions that you recommend the city take to remediate that, to obtain and submit cost estimates for each of those recommended actions, to identify potential funding sources and what portion of the cost they're likely to cover. This one's important so that the council can plan its budget. And, you know, obviously this is not an inexpensive thing to do. And we do hope that we're going to get grants to cover a good piece of it, but they may not cover all of it. So the city needs to plan for the portions it may need to cover. And then as sort of an add-on, to prepare a list of resources for property owners, because some people may want to take action on their own property beyond what the city's doing to protect the city in general. And then as a result of all your study and decisions, you'll prepare first an interim report about 6 months from now, and then a final report by April 23rd of next year, which is when your task force expires unless it's extended. There is a provision for you to engage third parties from government or academia, and if there are fees associated with that, you have a budget at this point of up to $5,000 for that. And if you find that you're going to need more, you can request that and have to go through council. So that's the overview. So Mr. Losco, if you would go over their legal requirements for this organization, this task force.
Thank you very much, Councilperson Souter. So my name is Dan Losco. I'm the city solicitor here in the city. Many of you know me already, or you've seen me at council meetings, something like that. So Mike, I'm going to give you a quick overview of the FOIA laws, the Freedom of Information Act laws, sometimes called sunshine laws. The idea here is that all public business needs to be open on the record, available to the public. That's the sum and substance of it. You are a public body created by our municipal council, and hence you are subject to these FOIA laws. And that means that all your decision-making, all your deliberations need to be made in public meetings where the public can attend, ask questions if you so permit it, and otherwise observe how you deliberate and the decisions that you're making. So I know some of this is old hat for you folks who are already on boards already, but this isn't a bad refresher. So meetings need to be advertised at least 7 days in advance. An agenda needs to be prepared like the one we had for tonight's meeting. That needs to be posted on the city's website. So city staff will take care of a good amount of that, but you're going to be creating your own agenda. So your job is going to be to get that to Kim and the city staff at least 7 days before, so they can get it properly posted. 10 days is more preferable. You want to be as specific as you can on your agendas. But that doesn't mean that you can't digress to new topics if something comes up in a public meeting. You have to keep minutes of your meetings, and these need to be posted on the website as well. It looks like Kathy is going to be your designated minute taker here. So she will have minutes typed up and prepared for you. At your next meeting, you'll need to all review those minutes and vote to approve, reject, or modify them. And those approved minutes are what will get posted on the website. One of the important things I want to impress upon you is that all your deliberations, again, need to be in an open meeting. So it gets really common these days to use email or pick up the phone, or you see somebody out at a restaurant maybe, and you start talking city business. When you have a quorum of this task force together, you really should not be speaking about any of the task force's objectives or any of its subjects that it's deliberating on outside of a public meeting. So you have to do your best to try and keep that to a minimum. It really becomes problematic with the emails, though. Somebody could, for example, send a document out to the entire task force, and there's nothing wrong with that and that alone. But what that tends to prompt are responses. So now responses are being made to the entire quorum of the task force, and you're now deliberating on public matters outside of a publicly called meeting. And that's a violation of the FOIA law that we need to avoid. Likewise, there's something known as a serial violation, and this is similar. I could email Tim, for example, on a task force item, and he responds. And then I go to Ms. Seitz, and I put the same question to her, and then I go down the line. So it's never a full quorum, but I'm presenting the same information in a series fashion to the task force. That too is a violation of FOIA. It's obviously an end run on what is the intent of the law, that there should be sunshine on your deliberations and the public should be aware of what's going on. All your decisions, your emails, your other communications, your agendas, your minutes are all subject to production under a FOIA request. Any member of the public can make a request for public documents. Everything you produce here is a public document, and that includes your own emails going back and forth on city business. Let me stop there and see if there are any questions you have for me before I go on.
So you're talking about our own personal emails? Or do we have could we possibly have a city email? So anything we did would be on a city email?
I doubt you're going to have your own city dedicated email address for a one-year task force. So you'll likely be using your own emails. But again, as you do it, I want you to be hesitant in doing it before you press that send button. Am I communicating with a quorum? Am I encouraging feedback, which is going to be a violation problem? We want to avoid that. So it's one thing to send out an informational blast, but don't prompt back and forth dialogue.
When you say if you have a quorum, you mean you have to send it to at least half the task force? Is that what you mean? Or?
Well, if you have a general communication that you want to get out to, let's say a report comes in that you want to share with the task force. There's nothing wrong with sending that report to every member of the task force. Now you've communicated with a quorum. What's problematic is dialogue on public business. So you've sent out that blast, and unless you're clear about not warning people, don't communicate back to me on this outside of one of our duly called meetings, because otherwise you're going to engage people back and forth in an innocent way, because people communicate by email all the time now. But this is why I'm trying to emphasize this. Be careful of that, because that is an inappropriate use of the communication. Yes, sir.
Yes, I belong to a committee that does not, it's a private organization, and we do not.
You don't have to comply with
We don't
FOIA.
have to comply with FOIA. However, I'm assigned as a representative of that group. How does reporting back to them say, as long as there's no business or no agenda discussed, is it legal for me to just say, I attended the first meeting?
Yes, you can report back to friends, neighbors, the organization you're a party to. The problem is communicating to a quorum of this committee, the majority of this committee, in a fashion that is outside of a duly called public meeting. So if you want
I
to,
was to email her and say, hey, we should bring up removing park benches at Battery Park. That's part of this task.
well, you just said you just communicated with one member of the task
Yeah.
force. That's not a violation.
Okay.
It's not a violation. It's a communication of a quorum, okay?
Ah,
But what you want to be careful of is that series thing. You communicate with one member, you got feedback from that one member. Now you go to the next person and the next person. on the same subject with the same question, that's a serial violation of the FOIA. Make sense?
Mr. Lesko, now this group has 7 members, so their quorum is 4.
It's gonna be a majority.
So 3 of you could engage in, well, what do you think we should do about this, and back and forth, and that's legitimate?
It's not a violation of the law, but it's really recommended that you do your discussions in a public meeting.
So if you
So-
come across some interesting piece of information that you think would benefit the group, and you send it to everyone and say, let's discuss this at our next meeting, end of email, that's no problem, right?
Not a problem, not a problem. Like I said, you can send out a single communication with a report or a comment, something like that. But what you want to refrain from is the back and forth dialogue when there's quorum involved, right? I pretty much covered everything I need to say. So even though it's your private email, if you're communicating on city-related business, that would be subject to a FOIA request. If we get a FOIA request, we will ask you, search your email records. If there's documents there that pertain to public business, we will have to produce it. So be careful what you say, of course. I know you'll be fine with that, but it's important to remember that this is all open to public scrutiny. All the meetings have to be open, as I said. You don't have to necessarily give opportunity for public comment unless you, via your chair, agree that that's what you would like to do. I would think that this is a good opportunity for that, but that's entirely this commission's or this task force's decision. Aside from that, I've already mentioned meeting minutes. There's not too much more. Are there any other questions for me? Yes, sir.
I just have one question. If someone requests for it, is that something that just goes directly to the city on, since they have a person that's taking notes and
Yes.
assigned strictly to that?
Typically, that's what happens, that the request will come into the city. Theoretically, somebody could send it to you. They know Tim Moore's on this task force, they could send you a FOIA request. Your job would be to tender it over to the city. The staff knows how to handle that. We're supposed to respond within 15 days. Whatever documents are being developed for production, I have to review, because there are exceptions to what is public record that is producible. For example, employee personnel records wouldn't typically be produced. Criminal investigation matters wouldn't be produced. I'm not saying this task force would be involved in any of that, but the idea is that I'm going to be looking at any type of a FOIA request and the documents that are being suggested to be produced. So
I do have one more question. So let's say somebody in the public emails me and says, so what happened at the meeting? And I recap the meeting. Is that part of a FOIA request? Would that
do
be?
we have a quorum involved in that?
Okay,
We don't?
okay.
You can
good.
talk to your friends, you can
Good,
talk
good,
to your
good.
neighbors,
Okay.
your spouse, your coworkers,
Great.
but you can't deliberate amongst the quorum of this task force on public business outside of a public meeting.
Okay.
Oh, and in terms of, you mentioned about advising the city, I guess Mr. Bartel is your point of contact for the,
He is our FOIA coordinator. One of his many assigned tasks as city administrator is to
What
be the
isn't he?
FOIA
It's a
coordinator.
smaller list, right?
That's right. So he is the FOIA coordinator. When it comes in, it's brought to his attention. He brings it to my attention. We then, sometimes it's me searching my records and emails, right? And so we will collaborate on what needs to be produced. And that means we may be communicating with you, asking what documents or emails you may have on a particular issue. They'll come to me, Mr. Barthel, we'll look them over, we'll compare them to the statute and what is exempted from production, and we produce whatever should be produced. End of story.
and while I'm thinking about it, Mr. Bartel is generally your point of contact. So if you decide to engage a consultant, you just have to let him know who that person is, so that when they submit their bill to the city, he doesn't say, what's this? Just to.
Okay.
That's not related to what Mr. Lasko is saying, but,
That's a good practical pointer. He'll be the one signing checks, right?
right.
Thank you very much. If there's no
Thank you.
questions.
Anybody else have questions on this? Okay, so now's the chance for all of you to introduce yourselves to each other, so you can help you have information to decide who you want to be your chair. Ms. Wyrick asked that you speak up, so because she has to keep record of this for the minutes. So who wants to start? Shall we just go
I'll
around?
start. My name is Alice Reel. I just recently retired as one of the owners of the Newcastle Weekly. So I did that for a while. My background though is I did graduated from law school and I practiced law for 8 years. Then I went into TV advertising sales and TV management. While I was doing that, I was living in upstate New York. This becomes relevant in a second. I was living in Owego, New York, and we had 300-year floods in 4 years. And each year I was living on the river, and each year the water got higher and higher. And then we had a year we didn't have a flood, and then it got higher. And the third time, the whole city was cut off, couldn't even get out of town for 3 days. And then you had to drive 10 miles north to go east. So I decided that I would leave there. And when I was moving, I put everything I had into a storage unit, came down here looking for a place to live. In the interim, we had another flood, flooded the storage unit. So everything I owned was gone, unless you could put it in a dishwasher or a clothes washer. So that is my really desire to do something on this committee, because I don't want that to happen here again to anybody. Anyway, that's my story.
Mr. Wilson?
Okay, my name is Thomas H. Wilson. Most people know me by Tommy. I have lived on the Delaware River for this coming mischief night will be 50 years. I always tell everybody I live 70 yards from mean high tide, and that hasn't changed much over the 50 years. So I have seen, I grew up just outside the city. I live near the Buttonwood area. I'm familiar with the railroad bridge back there and the drainage system back to the river that I don't think has ever worked properly. If you go in the summertime to where up Buttonwood Avenue, if you go up Buttonwood Avenue on your left-hand side, headed towards the tracks before the last 3 houses, that area constantly stays flooded. I think it's more of a mosquito danger than it is a flooding danger, but that's another story. And then my disappointment with the dikes not being dredged over my lifetime, which I think is a contributor to some of the problems in Van Dyke Village and Route 9. I worked at ICI America for 28 years, which is right on the river. One of my jobs was maintaining the cooling water coming in from the river. So very knowledgeable of tides and things like that for the river. So the river's kind of one of my kids, and so I want to make sure I'm involved in anything that we do with it. So.
Mike?
My name is Mike Marinelli, and I live in Van Dyke Village. I guess my only connection to this issue is that the floodplain is rapidly approaching my doorstep virtually. I am working for the trustees as property manager, been there 7 years, and before that I worked for the city of Wilmington as managing the revenue division. It's a 9-year sentence, and before that it was Newcastle County. I managed the property tax division for about 20 years there. Because I live in Van Dyke, is why I was asked to be on this task force to represent that neighborhood, which is, like I said, threatened by the rising sea level. So I hope I can help the city work through the issues.
I'm Gail Seitz. I live on the Strand, on the riverside. We're in the 100-year floodplain. It's a historic house, late 1700s. Lots of people have lived there before me. Hopefully lots of people can live in the house after me. My background, I'm retired right now, a number of professions. None of them really related to engineering or flood protection. But as far as the city's concerned, I currently chair the Planning Commission, and as Suzanne noted, there's a section in the comp plan on sea level rise and flooding, and so very interested there. I serve as the city's representative to WillMapCo, the regional planning organization, and I'm on the committee for the transportation plan, which is being developed for the city. There is an objective around flooding, although that's not a major emphasis on that particular study. And I've been involved in some citizen groups for those who live on the river and flood, trying to get some initiatives going. But it's been difficult, so I hope that this group can maybe help motivate something to be done in the gap in the city, which is between the Gambacorta Dike and the Broad Dike, which I live in, but also the whole historic district is in the gap between the dikes and then the berms that extend a bit into Battery Park and Bull Hill Park. The flooding at our house has increased quite a bit. Our neighbors and I say that we probably get about 6 times a year now when the river overflows the banks. And some of the worst, since we've lived there 20 years, or about 20 years, Hurricane Sandy, which almost came onto the first floor, not quite. But there was and we all evacuated for that one, but then about a month later, there was a nor'easter, which came up just as high, and it was a surprise. So, you know, the water was rushing up the Strand and Harmony Street for that one. There was a storm the end of October where the water came up almost to the Strand, so all the way up to the houses, up the alleyways, and almost to the Strand. And all of my neighbors' basements flooded. And the new owners on the corner of the Strand and Harmony Street said they had 3.5 feet of water in their basement, and they were new owners and they didn't know not to store things in their basement. So they lost a lot of things. A lot of the times when the river comes over, we call it nuisance flooding. So my neighbors say they hate to mulch because every time they mulch, the river comes over and floods the garden, and then the mulch is everywhere. And I actually brought just a couple pictures from trying to get people to get, sometimes a picture can express, but we can look out our second floor window and you see the river coming over the banks, and then you run and you check the tide charts and you go, okay, we have 2 more hours. How much further is it going to come up? But it's just happening more and more often. So I guess that's my main concern and reason for wanting to be here.
Okay, thanks, Rick.
I'm Rick Pennell. I also live on the Strand, on the other side of where Gail lives, on the non-river side. I lived there for 15 years and have yet to have any water because I'm on the very edge of the floodplain. I'm retired. Formerly, I used to work for Conrail, and then after Conrail was sold, I opened up my own consulting business for rail logistics. My interest is in the river because for the past 30 years, I have either sailed or boated on the river up and down, from the port all the way down to below Delaware City, and fairly familiar with the tides and the currents. Again, like Gail and CJ, I've done many studies of the tide, wind, and charts, and have been fairly able to predict what the rise will be along Packet Alley. So far, so good, but I'm here to see if we can't do better with more protection, protect the historic district.
Tim Moore with Goodwill Fire Company. I've been with Goodwill for 24 years, though I can't echo that I'm retired. I still got a few more years to go. I currently serve as one of the captains with the fire company. I don't currently live in the city, however, my family has strong roots in the city from Shawtown all the way to the Strand. I look forward to this committee and the open discussions and seeing what comes out, what we can send forth, not only to the community, but to the citizens. I don't want to say I had the fortunate part, but Hurricane Sandy, I was the incident commander for that. It kind of like took us by surprise and all, being all staffed up, preparing for the worst, and then it kind of like was a dud, then it had a little lull, and then we kind of got caught at the end. So that was interesting, just trying to help facilitate that with evacuations, the National Guard, that kind of stuff. I was also part of back, I believe in 2000 for Hurricane Floyd, where Astor Boulevard is by Riverbend there, with water probably at least 6 feet up at that point on Route 9. So I have a little bit of knowledge with over the years with flooding and what we encountered, what we had to do to try to make things the best of the situation. So.
Okay, thank you. All right, so you look like you want to say something.
I was wondering if everybody else could introduce themselves. I was wondering,
Oh, just the members of the public?
yeah.
Okay, do you
who's
mind
here and
just
why?
going around and saying who's here and you want to start, Ms. Taylor?
I have to start first. Okay. My name is Sandra Taylor, and I live at William Penn Square, and I've been there this year 31 years. And I am retired. I worked for Christiana Care for 40 years. And my interest is, just to see, the interest of finding out what can be done, what is to be done, and share back with some of my neighbors in that area to let them know. And two, my church was just hit with the Hurricane Ida, and we're still not impacted. That we just so surprised. In 66 years we've been there and never had a issue with flooding. And this year in September we had an issue with that. So I think I saw it was either in the newsletter with the electric bill, or either the newsletter that hit that I saw this, and I mentioned to Pete Toner, and he in turn introduced me to Susan. So that's why I'm here tonight, and hopefully I can be a part of whatever is going on and share with the neighbors. And I've not had any issues with any flooding or water or anything at this point.
Okay, next is Mr. Athey, who we're going to hear from later. So
I'm gonna have the floor in a moment, so I can.
Mr. Henkowski.
Bill Henkowski. I live on the 100 block of 2nd Street, so we're pretty high. We don't have a flooding problem, but it's a citywide problem. But I have an interest in it, so I'm here.
Mr.
Yes, Tom Whitehead. I moved over from Pennsville 20 years ago. And I started my surveying career in the Seabees 1961. I've been a licensed surveyor in Delaware for 52 years. In 3 other states, I still hold that license. was in business from 75 forward. They've done fine.
Already.
That's it.
20 years already?
What's that?
20 years already, dude.
All right, and well, that's Kim, Ms. Bergmiller works for the city, and you, sir?
Bill Garrity, I'm a new resident here. My wife and I stumbled onto this lovely city, fleeing Philadelphia when we were staying for visiting our grandkids. And we bought the vacant lot next to the new municipal parking lot on 3rd Street, down the street from Booth Tavern. And we're deep in. I'll be filing an application to the historical committee on Thursday to build a new single-family residence for my wife and I for our retirement. So I'm working closely with Mirstone Consultants, engineers, and others. So I'll be at the cutting edge of, we're in the flood zone, obviously, of what the future holds. And what FEMA demands and what the city recognizes for a new building in this historic city. I'm also retired building inspector, and I was the floodplain manager for the village of the Marinac up in Westchester County, New York, an area that also very challenged by hurricanes. And I think all of us in the room probably can quote from Gloria to Sandy to all the others from the 50s on, major hurricane events in our lives and our families' lives. So it's good to be with you, and let's see what we can do.
Okay, thank you.
Glenn Rowe, Jerry, this is Joanne, I'm for cheerleaders.
I'm Joe Day. I'm on city council and I live at 3rd and South.
Mr. Gross?
Yeah, my name's Phil Gross, just a young 7-year resident of the city of Newcastle, but love it. And now an upcoming crew person for the Kalmar Nickel, which I've noticed the tides changing and the mud and the depth of the pier area, which is very concerning as far as the depth of the Kalmar Nickel being able to pull in, and a member of Newcastle Matters. So a lot of stuff going on, and thank you for being a part of this group. It's well needed. Thank you.
I'm Matt Alexander. I moved to town 3 years ago. I live in Washington Park. We don't really have a flood issue directly, but I'm interested in the issue, and I'm here covering the meeting for the weekly and town topic.
So I don't know how you all want to handle selecting a chair, if you want to nominate someone or nominate yourself, but the floor is yours, the 6 of you.
You know, when this happens, you usually nominate the person who's absent.
Somebody suggested that.
Councilperson Suzanne?
Yes.
Reading the additional appointments may be made. Is there a plan to do that?
Potentially, I mean, one of the people who's here tonight is here to find out more about it and potentially would be interested in joining. So we have 2 more under the current resolution allowed for 5 to 9, and we have 7. So there's potential for 2 more. There's some areas of the city that aren't yet represented, and we're hoping that those 2 seats will be filled by people from the areas in town that are not yet represented, and that are vulnerable to flooding.
I heard a few people make public comments, sound like to me.
Right? That's a
Good,
possibility.
Additions to the task force.
If that's a possibility. And I guess if you choose a chair now, that doesn't mean you can't change that later, right?
You can change it, yeah.
Well, I hesitate to say this, but if nobody else is interested in being chair, I guess I have the time to do it. But again, if somebody else is interested, please nominate yourself. Please nominate yourself.
I second her motion.
Oh.
Surprise. All in favor?
Great, thanks.
Alice, you'll be great.
All right. Well, then the next thing is for Mr. Athey to tell us about the work that's been done so far on this issue. Thank you.
Thank you. Would it be okay, maybe I pulled up a chair there?
Of
I might
course.
be standing for a while soon, but I didn't want to have my back to the new chair, so. All right, well, thank you, everybody. I'm David Athey. I think I know probably about half of you at the table here. I've been fortunate enough to have been the city engineer for about 20 years now, doing things that you would expect a civil engineer to do. Some of the road work you've seen at Delaware Street recently, and then even going back in time, 14th Street, even 9th Street. Some survey work, helped Mr. Bergstrom, more or less as needed. And some years back, the Delaware Coastal Programs, which resides at DENREC, put out what's called an RFP, a request for proposals. They had created what they call the Resilient Community Partnership. And it's not a grant per se, but they kind of partner with municipalities to start working on resiliency. We applied, this is maybe 2017 or so. Unfortunately lost that year to Slaughter Beach. But roughly a year later or 8-9 months later, DENREC contacted the city and said, we have money to do this again. Are you guys still interested? And so we met with DENREC and, sketched out a scope of work, et cetera. And that led to what I think is probably a good starting point for the committee, but we'll, defer to the chair and how you all want to proceed. And that would be the vulnerability assessment. So a copy of it here, which was published, I believe, 2018, March 2018, so four years ago. And then we've done some other work since then. But what Councilwoman Souter asked me to do is just kind of give a summary of a lot of the things the city has been working on, really for over a decade now. So I thought I'd do is kind of run through that. And I don't know, again, I could talk for 3 hours on this or,
Well,
5 or 10 minutes, but why don't I do kind of the 5, 10 minute, 15 kind of a thing?
Yeah,
And
and
then,
take questions and see where it goes.
and I think the dialogue is probably where the real benefit will be. So the first couple things I wanted to talk about, and I'm assuming this document was distributed. I see enough copies. Okay, that I was not personally involved with, but I think I can talk, reasonably well. Back in about 2011, the Newcastle Conservation District got involved with the city. The dikes at that time were frankly in really pretty bad shape. A lot of animal burrow holes. They weren't high enough. They, wavered at the top, et cetera. So the district with the city, and I believe the state was involved as well, spent a great deal of money raising and improving each of the dikes. There was a bit of a problem with that, though, and I think we talked about already mentioned that. I think everybody would agree with you. The so-called 100-year storm event keeps getting more frequent, and the climate change, et cetera, et cetera. Partway through the dike process, FEMA remapped floodplain, which is what they do. They're supposed to do it every 5 years, but I don't think they do it quite that often. And unfortunately, when they remapped it, the elevation is now higher than the top of those dikes. So they're helpful, they protect, but they're not going to frankly protect you in a really nasty hurricane if FEMA's modeling is correct. They're at elevation 8.5 and the current flood elevation is at 9. However, they definitely got reinforced, all that nice riprap you see, been able to withstand waves a lot better. So I don't want to say it wasn't a worthy project. And I should also say that it did open up some funding mechanism because they got a certain level of certification to do that. So then I believe probably, again, I think the Conservation District was involved in this, the Coastal Protection Concept Study, which I think focused mostly on the area around the Strand and Gail talked about, and this is a pretty major problem. It's not just the dikes. You've got gaps between the dikes, so you can raise the dikes all you want, but unless you also close the gaps between them, we all know what would happen. So the study focused on just some very conceptual ways that the area kind of around the Strand, and that was a focused area because it frankly sits low and is also, again, the gap between two of the other dikes. And then little by little, I know that some work is being done along on Battery Park, a living shoreline design. Again, it's not really a sea level rise adaptation type of a project, but definitely helps in a sustainability resiliency sense, protecting Battery Park with future wave actions and such. It could erode away, and I believe part of the intent of that project is just to shore that up much better. So that brings us back to the vulnerability assessment. This was a very broad brushed, very high level assessment. One of the big outcomes we found is that the city or the state or any, there's really not a wealth of data to make some of the really important decisions that we'll be getting to in the not too distant future. But we, did what we could with the data that we did have. And this, I should also say, was what we typically would call a bathtub model. Whereas, and again, you all live in Newcastle or been here for a long time. It's not just the height of the water you got to worry about, it's the wave action. This was not a wave modeling project. That gets really complicated, all sorts of dynamics set. But what we did is we literally took, here's the current FEMA 100-year flood plain. DENREC has projected anywhere from 0 to 5 feet of sea level rise. This is published data, so hopefully you all are aware of that. We looked at different probabilities, and we basically took the current FEMA 100-year flood elevation, added 2 feet to it as kind of the mid-range, and then 5 feet to it as the more catastrophic range. And we literally kind of remapped the FEMA flood plain and identified the structures, critical structures included, like
This
obviously.
is just based on topography, is that right?
The excellent question, based on topography, yes. And mapped where and I should say that mapped topography, it was not survey topography, hence one of the data gaps. And the other thing, and then I'm getting ahead of myself, and I might go back and forth between these a little bit. We did not have floor elevations. So we kind of, that was a big unknown on that. But we identified a lot of things that could or should happen. We grouped them into kind of administrative actions. We grouped them into, and then Gail was on the task force, which is where she and I first met. We grouped things that what I would call standalone, and frankly, one of them was keep the task force going. And maybe there's a few-year gap, but I'm very pleased to see you all around the table tonight, because I think these conversations really need to be had. We also looked at what we call the sequential recommendations, and that would be, get some survey work, get some data, et cetera, to start doing some better modeling the midterm to finally lead to some sort of what sooner or later is probably going to have to be structural measures or some sort of a real action. So that's kind of what the vulnerability assessment laid all that out. And I'm quite certain we'll circle back to that. So I'll just leave that where it is for the time being. As that study was wrapping up, I guess the Delaware Coastal Programs kind of liked what they were seeing we were doing, and they approached us and said, hey, we have some money left over from another contract. Are you interested in taking the vulnerability assessment to the next level? Sure. So we kept kind of chipping away at it, and now might be a good time to introduce, we'll, I'm sure get into a lot of different terms, floodproofing measures for homes and businesses. You get two different ways to look at it, is what's called dry flood proofing and wet flood proofing. Very huge distinction. Dry flood proofing are gates, structural membranes on, in other words, to keep the water out. Whereas wet flood proofing are things like vents and things of that nature, which allow the water to come in. FEMA looks at these very differently. The city code, which is consistent with the state code and the federal FEMA, of when and where you can dry flood proof. It is not done on residential structures, and I'm bringing that up for a reason that we'll circle back to at some other time. It's really for commercial structures. But what you really want to do is get your floor elevation above that floodplain, and frankly, we didn't have that data still. So we kind of looked, took a stab at, how can you flood proof in a historic area? Historic structures have their own issues. If you think about dry flood proofing, hydrostatic pressure, you get 2-3 feet of water on a wall, what's going to happen? That wall is going to want to tumble down. So can older structures withstand that? I mean, there's a whole myriad of issues. The other thing that study did do that I think was really valuable is looked more closely at what it would take to raise the dikes and close the gaps between the dikes. Still pretty conceptual, but again, little by little, we're getting better here, or more detailed. So the dikes now, if you look at it, they're essentially trapezoidal shape, right? For all intent, flat on the top, slope sides, and then a base, a bottom base. They're already too low. So if they're going to get raised, we're talking about raising them 2 feet, 3 feet, 4 feet. Now you get into this probability kind of thing. But if you think about just simple geometry, if the current dikes are like this and you want to raise them, it's not just a matter of doing that. You'd have to keep those same slopes. So your footprint of the dikes, if you continue to keep them as earthen structures, increases. If they're, say, a 2-to-1 side slope on both sides, that's a 4-to-1 difference. So you raise them 2 feet, those dikes are now 8 feet wider. You raise them 4 feet, those dikes are 16 feet wider. And so the math just keeps going on. So environmental issues, property issues. Does the space even exist? A lot of problems doing that. The other way you could do it would be to put up some sort of a structural wall that would just kind of sit vertically, on top of the dikes. That again isn't the easiest thing in the world to do, but at least you could preserve the existing footprint of the dikes. Aesthetically, not a great choice. Lots of trade-offs in all of this.
What happens around the dike?
Be more
What happens
specific.
if you put just a wall up there? What happens around? Does the water just go around the dike?
Thank you. The second part of it was, and I think Gail alluded to this earlier, is ways to close the gaps. And we look, and part of the problem with this is you have like Delaware Street, is it Chestnut Street where MSC is, their office, right? So you have these rights of way that people use. So, what the option that we thought was probably the best way to do it would be a gate that you could kind of raise when you needed to, and then lower when you don't need to. Across Delaware Street, across Chestnut Street, and again, you'd still have to do something because now you, in a way, you just keep. Maybe this is your point. You just keep putting your weakest link somewhere else by doing all this stuff. So
Wilmington.
Well, you might actually get to that point one of these days. Yes, sir.
I have a question. You talk about raising the dikes up, but when I was little, when I was down there swimming when I wasn't supposed to be, the dikes were 6 to 9 feet deep all the way back. And they've never been dredged. And if you went down instead of raising the dike up so that the actual flow in and out would hold more water, wouldn't that be beneficial? Or how come that hasn't been looked at? Am I missing something? Because
I don't want to say it wouldn't help, but how much? Well, why don't you hold that, because that, I think it's actually next up on the list here. It is what we call the Echo Assessment Project. So that's actually a real good segue to the next text. If that's okay, I'll answer it as I'm doing this. So we've actually been fairly successful with this resilient community partnership. So we approached them again. One of the recommendations out of the vulnerability assessment was what further assessment of what could happen with sea level rise to the marsh areas themselves, the flora, the fauna, the flood storage component, et cetera. So we got another resilient community partnership, and this is now much more recent, only in the last couple of years. And for that, there's a group, and I guess disclosure, I was actually on the board of the Partnership for the Delaware Estuary. It's one of the 28 NEPs, National Estuary Programs in the United States. The Center for the Inland Bays kind of gets a little bit more press downstate, but they're essentially the same type of organizations. A nonprofit that looks at work in the Delaware Estuary. They're a fantastic organization. So long and short of it is we partnered together on the application to the DNREC coastal programs. The partnership handled all the ecosystem assessments. It's actually really quite interesting what they did is they took the 3 marsh areas, and then they also investigated a marsh area farther up the river that doesn't have a dike, which is kind of their benchmark, if you will, and compared how the dikes in Newcastle from purely from an ecological standpoint are behaving compared to the undiked marsh. It was really quite interesting. As the engineer, though, what I looked at more closely was what type of capacity do the tide gates that control the flow into the marsh areas, what are those capacities? What could we do to change them? And then maybe now I am answering your question. Are there ways that we could enhance the storage capacity, not just because of storage itself, but from an ecological standpoint? Some things thrive in marsh areas, some things don't. And so again, that's where I relied on the partnership, that this is, the flow regime you would want, et cetera, et cetera. The problem, I guess there's kind of 2 problems with the thought about storing more water in the marsh areas. You don't have a whole lot of latitude. I believe you said you live in Van Dyke Village, so you're already, I don't know if you mentioned the flood elevation's already lapping up to your doorstep. Frankly, the vulnerability assessment, some of the mapping we had identified a lot of the structures in Van Dyke Village as the lower ones that could very easily be impacted. So if you start putting more water in the dike areas, you could actually be exacerbating some flooding situations. The other problem is you never find enough storage. If you're battling a nor'easter or a hurricane coming up the bay, that's an infinite amount of water. You're never going to be able to store enough. You might lower the elevation otherwise this much, but you're dealing with 100, if not 1,000 times the amount of water that you could store in the dike. In the marsh area. So kind of two pronged of limited in its ability to help. Let's see, I think we covered the ecosystem project fairly well. So that brings us up to the present. It's not just the Delaware coastal programs that has money to do this stuff. Also looking around and found through DEMA, which is Delaware's FEMA, a lot of money, and this is before all the bipartisan infrastructure bill stuff, to do pre-disaster mitigation planning. And so working with DEMA, we had to actually do it twice, I believe, which is not uncommon with these grants. It's a little bit tough to get one the first time out. But the second time out, we were able to get money to the tune that three quarters of the current effort is being paid for by actually FEMA, but it comes through DEMA with only the city kicking in the last quarter. But I've said a few times here, we've really been hampered by the lack of really good data. So we pitched this idea to DEMA and FEMA, and they agreed with it, at least second time around. That and I believe you all should have gotten a letter. I guess it was just the affected households. Now that I think about it,
I think it was just the.
Right.
of the
household.
600 or so.
Right, yeah.
Yes, what we did, and sooner or later, I mean, I'm happy to bring exhibits and some of the mapping. I wasn't really sure what to bring with me tonight. Back to the vulnerability assessment again. We took basically the 3 main maps we prepared. Current flood elevation, where are the structures in the floodplain? 2-foot rise, obviously more structures now. 5-foot wise, even more structures. And prioritized, obviously the lowest ones first, and then worked with a firm called McBride and Ziegler, which has done a lot of surveying work in Newcastle. Kind of negotiated a fee, if you will, that they have been out there, and they should be getting pretty close to wrapping up. Where they have been getting that first floor elevation and the lowest, what's called lowest adjacent grade elevation next to each of these 600 plus or minus houses, which is the data we've needed forever. So that is currently ongoing, and again, that part of it should be wrapped up pretty soon.
Is that so let's say a house is in the floodplain and it will flood, that you know that the water can flow through, like you said, the wet,
Wet
through-
flood proofing.
yeah, wet flood proofing, and so that it won't damage the house itself if the elevation of the house is high enough? Is that what that's about?
More or less. Excellent question. The flood elevation is at 9, if you have a floor, well, and the city also, again, a lot of terms are gonna get thrown out. The city also has what's called a freeboard requirement. In the building code, you don't want to let somebody build something, a brand new house, if you will. I'm sure you're dealing with this now. You don't want to build it with a floor elevation of 9.1. The maps aren't that accurate, and that's before anybody even considered sea level rise. This is freeboard's been either a requirement or at least a strong recommendation for many, many years. So the city's freeboard, I believe, is either a foot or a foot and a half. Jeff Burns, frankly, runs a really good program in Newcastle. So say your floor elevation is at 11, that's not too bad. You're 2 feet above the flood elevation. And yes, you could then be looking at, as difficult as this may sound, of putting in some vents. And if the big flood's coming, just get the stuff you need out of the basement and.
When I was, I don't know if you heard, but I've been flooded many times.
Oh, yeah.
And I was really surprised to hear that people say, oh, if you have a window down there, open it up so that the flood can go through and, not go, go into your house and not push your house, number one, and also spread out the water a little bit, I
Mhm.
guess, right?
Yep.
Yeah. I know somebody who just closed off a window and they're off of Battery Park because they didn't want the water to come in. I said, I don't think that's a great idea.
They may regret that. Water, the hydrostatic pressure, they could find their basement frankly caved in.
Yeah.
Don't want to sound hyperbolic, but that's a possibility.
Mhm.
What about private property? For example, the Strand, a lot of the Strand houses own property out into the river.
We do.
Right.
Yeah, how do you address that?
Could you be more specific?
Well,
You have the
Would-
berm out there? you mean?
yeah, like if you, let's say we said we were gonna do a berm from Fort Cashmere down to the boat club at the end of 3rd Street.
Right,
You have a lot of private property in between them.
right.
And actually Fort Cashmere is private property. So how would you address that?
Again, I'm not, so if a berm or some sort of a structure were to be built, if that's your question, then it's a very good one, because now you're right, the city would need, at the very least, easements, if not outright acquisition. That I think would be a challenge to get. No, that's a good question.
So some of us along the Strand have met and talked about doing a berm with the understanding, well, so first of all, we'd have to agree to do it and then have some sort of an easement. Now, we've been talking more about a maintenance easement rather than it being a public use easement.
Yeah.
But anyway, some sort of an easement, especially for maintenance.
Excellent, yes. The details would need to be
Yes,
worked out,
yes.
and obviously for construction as well,
And
construction,
construction,
vehicle
right.
access and things of that nature,
Right.
right?
Noticing those faults.
I have a
Our property would run like that.
bottom line question.
Taking notes, right?
The recommendations of this report,
Uh-huh.
have any of them been followed?
A few. No, I'm sorry, that was too negative a response. Some of them. Some of the administrative ones, again, this committee, that certainly ticks one of them off. As far as I know, Mr. Bergstrom is on, very much on top of the community rating system. I think there were some other, like public education type events that I'm not sure have really happened. We are, kind of little by little getting at the, I won't call them more substantive recommendations. Again, we're collecting the data that are needed to again, really what are the decisions that may need to be made here.
So would you say that this would be a good blueprint for us?
I think that would be it is probably the best overall document to start from.
And that's what the planning commission took this study, and that's really what's in the comprehensive plan around this, which is a 10-year plan. But yes, it's a
So,
good-
speaking of that, Alice actually asked for a copy of this and Ms. Bergmiller provided it to her, and I have one extra one. And Mr. Athey's summary also provides a link to the online version. So I don't know how many of you would like hard copies, but we can certainly get them for you if you want them.
I was on the task force and I just only seemed out a draft, so I would love to have one.
Okay.
I can give it to you, but I.
You all want hard copies?
That would be a
Okay.
great idea.
So,
It also has these great maps.
Yeah.
so here's one,
Really,
and Alice says, so we need 5, assuming Tish wants 1 too, Ms. Gallagher.
one of the things that I read here, and I don't remember where I read it, but the gates, would that be called the Delaware log at some point, or?
The Delaware lot, so
They said the recommendation was for the Delaware Street log.
oh, yeah, well,
Is that the
I'm
gate?
sorry, yeah, and this gets a little bit farther into the details. There are multiple ways. I mentioned the gate that literally do this.
Right.
There is what's called a stop log system where essentially you have the rails, if you will, on either side of Delaware Street or wherever you're doing it. This is actually fairly common in buildings. And I guess the good news is if it's a hurricane coming with modern reporting, you know days in advance. It's not like a tornado or an earthquake or something that you got to be ready for on literally no notice. So you would have time to kind of, put logs in place or something of that.
Oh, okay, so it's an actual log. I thought it was a euphemism.
Let's call it log shaped. I mean,
Okay.
they come in
Log
different
adjacent.
materials. I mean, log
Right.
to me means
Okay.
wood. I don't necessarily be wood, but
Okay, but that was a proposal, that's not been done either, right?
nothing is solid at this point.
Okay.
These are all just different ways to do it and looking at pros and cons and of course, costs. If I may, because I was just about done, there was one
Oh,
other
sorry.
aspect of the current study that I did want to mention. We also worked with, if any of you are on HAC or go to HAC meetings, Layla Hamroon is the city's historic architect. She works for a company called Tetra Tech. We actually worked with her as well, and I don't think she's started. I asked her for an update, and I think she's traveling and didn't get back to me. But they are to be entering, whereas McBride and Ziegler can do all of their work outside. They can kind of go to, you can see where people's floor elevation is from the outside. Look at the stoop on the steps, or at least be reasonably close. And of course, the outside elevations are outside. But Layla and her team at Tetra Tech are to be going inside residences, or at least those that will allow them inside, and try to do a better assessment of, maybe back to your point, some of the basements. And this is now, I guess I'm finally kind of reaching a good conclusion where we kind of lacked for a few years. We're finally getting to a much better point of the floor elevations that would indicate, is this a wet floodproofing measure, a dry? And again, there's FEMA code issues that I can get into in a moment. What would the depth of water be? That'd be the other thing. If it's dry flood proof, you can't withstand 5 or 6 feet of water. So there are also some practical limitations to when you can do all this. But then with Tetra Tech looking into the basements, they'll also be able to get like a basement height, even though it's not a structural assessment, at least some sort of an idea, what is a basement made out of? Can it withstand certain things? Are there already existing openings? Things of that nature. So that's the other pretty major piece. So we'll put it all together and again, kind of keep getting a little bit farther down the path of, I don't know if I maybe overly simplistic, kind of call it the fork in the road, but I think where this ultimately one day may go is either a decision to find the money, deal with the easement issues, get the permits, whatever, go find the money and then find the money of raising the dikes and create what I kind of call like the New Orleans type of a situation. Or I hate to be this candid about it, just kind of accept that the sea level rise is going to impact Newcastle and we better start making sure the structures can deal with it one way or the other.
Now, with these structure evaluations, and you said if you could get into people's basements,
Right.
would you offer a preventative steps for them or recommendations for the homeowner themselves? I mean, that might be incentive to get somebody in their house.
Yeah, no, honestly, no, I'm sorry. I guess I think I might be slightly misleading here then. We are, where the vulnerability assessment was at 10,000 feet, now we're maybe at more like 5,000 or, even 2,000 or 3,000. We're not at the point.
We're not at ground level.
Yeah, we're not at the ground level. And I'm sorry, I didn't mean to imply that at the end of the day, we'll be able to go to any one of your homes and say, oh, well, here's what you need to do. And, here's a, concept or something. This is still high level, not as high level, but what we believe we'll do at the end of the day is of the, say, 600 homes, hopefully be able to say, 300 of these could be candidates for wet flood proofing. Another 200 of them, we find the flood elevation is just, too high and the floor elevation is too low. And there could be some major, and maybe it's a kind of a hybrid approach, is maybe there's some sort of other structure built to protect a certain number of structures that are most vulnerable and can't be renovated for some of these flood proofing measures. But again, the good news is we're really actually fairly close to finally having some really good data we can look at. And then last, I did include, as Councilwoman Souter's suggestion, a bunch of different resources. If you all wanted to kind of look into this a little bit more, started with the Delaware's Climate Action Plan. That only came out last fall. That was literally hot off the press. DenRec has been looking at sea level rise for quite a few years now. I'm sure if you look into that page a little bit, you could see their projections. And again, the 5 foot, they kind of stand by. Again, that's a kind of an extreme, and it wouldn't be till about 2100, but that's, it's only 80 years away now. The Delaware coastal programs, maybe if you want to see what, I know Lewis was the recipient of the most recent Resilient Community Partnership. They sooner or later, I'm sure they'll have that ecosystem project on their website. They just haven't posted it yet. There's a group called Rascal, the Resilient and Sustainable Communities League. It's kind of a loose coalition of DenRec employees and some nonprofit people that get together for kind of what they call coffees every couple of months. Delaware Sea Grant is with the university out of the Lewis campus. And then there's also the university has put together a couple of neat things, a funding database. Because again, none of this stuff would be inexpensive, as well as what they call a complete communities checklist, which kind of gets more to the overall sustainability measures. So I went there maybe a little bit longer than 15 minutes, but hopefully that was a good overview for you all. And
Is there any Delaware community that's farther ahead than we are?
not that I'm aware of. Lewis has done a fair amount of work. Rehoboth actually is not in too bad a shape. They kind of sit high, believe it or not. The flood maps are not that impacting as one would think, maybe I should say, as Rehoboth. It's Bethany, and I think it's South Bethany. They have a lot of work to do.
So in the Inland Bay areas, Ocean View and.
Yeah, and I haven't even looked inland a little bit farther. Yeah. Yeah.
I was living down there in 1962, so I remember driving when the big storm tore up the boardwalk, but it in inland flooding too, because the storm sat there for like 3 tide cycles. So
Do you see Delaware City's seawall being affected? I mean, there are problems with it in that storm water piles up behind it, has to be pumped off.
Thank you. I knew I was kind of omitting one thing. That is, I know Jeff Bergstrom has talked about this frequently. The other thing with dikes, whatever, is you may have the situation where you need to pump the water to get it back out to the river. That's the other thing we looked at with this. The ecosystem project is, and again, we kind of hate to keep saying we lack data, but that got into some pretty complicated modeling. Is water flows by gravity. We all know that. If you have a pipe that's sloped like this, the water is going to flow, but it only does that if there's the end is open. As the sea level rises, we're really wondering if the dikes are going to be able to drain themselves by gravity. They may get to the point where they won't. And now you're back to, if you can't even get rid of the water, and there's also storm inlets that drain into each of those marsh areas as well, back to potentially causing flooding by inaction. and or the result of sea level rise. So again, this is, super complicated stuff all over the board.
Don't we have that at Route 9 and Ferry Cutoff? Don't we have a pump there now that pumps water back into the dike from
I'm
beyond
not
the gas station?
aware of that. That doesn't mean, now DelDOT, I mean, that's, Route 9 is of course a DelDOT road. So they may do some actions, but I know exactly what you're referring to. And I believe Delaware City, and I also work for Delaware City, slightly different capacity, but to the best of my knowledge, they are working to actually do some work to get rid of that pump behind it. But it's a great question and a great observation that depending on what you do, you could cause trouble behind it and need to pump.
But the seawall, in case of a hurricane or a storm, seems to take care of the flooding.
Yeah,
at the moment.
to the best at the moment. To the best of my knowledge, it's been successful. It's very structural, and I don't know if you all are familiar with it. It's cofferdam base. I mean, they drive piles and then kind of cap it so it looks a little bit nicer. But I mean, it's hard armoring. But yeah, it's overall effective. But you just hit the operative word for the time being. And I'm not even sure what elevation that is at. And
Where exactly is it? Is it the end of Clinton Street
Yeah.
down there?
yeah,
What about the canal? I mean, doesn't water come through the canal up? Does it go beyond the wall? You know what I mean? Is it,
Seawall
the
runs
seawall goes
the
along
seawall all the
along the
way up
canal?
along the canal and
Ah.
up to the Route 9 Bridge.
Oh,
yeah.
okay.
The
And
branch,
then the
the branch canal.
elevation dips down a little bit into the
Correct.
grasslands,
Is that
grass,
marshland down there?
right.
Yeah, okay.
I don't know if it's somebody I think needs to recognize somebody who's not. at the-
Okay, we do have a section for public comments
Oh,
coming up,
okay.
so if you just
I
got a
had
minute,
one,
Mr. Whitehead.
So I'm sorry. Yeah, at the end of Clinton Street, and again, is
Mr. Wilson asked about dredging the dikes, the marshes.
right.
What about excavate? I mean, really deep excavate? And basically a lake.
Kind of the same answer is if you would want to do that purely or mostly from a flood mitigation standpoint, you're never going to come up with enough volume to do it. The other thing is the marshes do self-flush more or less now, which is good from an ecological standpoint. We question if that's going to continue to very far into the future. Again, what I said a moment ago is sea level rise really does get 2-3 feet higher, even during just regular tides, and you get a storm event, marsh may not drain, and now you get into stagnant water issues, and it's et cetera, et cetera. So I would say that would still have kind of limited benefit.
What about, and a lot of these questions I'm asking are just old wives' tales that I've heard, and the silt that's run off into the dike.
Mhm.
That's part of the problem. That's why the dikes are not as deep as they used to be. It
Right.
seems like that the state came in and said, okay, we're gonna maintain this marshland. And it's only 6 inches deep in some places.
Right,
And that's the way it's always been. That's not the way it's always been.
right.
And with the new developments coming in, Wilmington Manor Gardens, Stockton, things like that, there's more runoff to the. Did that have any effect on why the dikes are, because I look at it as a bathtub.
Mhm.
If you poured so much into a bathtub, it would hold so much. But if you took the bottom out of that tub and brought it up, now it's not going to hold as much. The water's going to go towards,
Right.
it's going to spread out. So the dike area is much bigger than it used to be. And will that cause it to, if we
Yeah.
don't do anything with dredging, will it cause the dike to continue to grow out?
Yeah, honestly, we didn't look at, or thus far have not looked at increasing the volumes in the dikes by dredging. I think maybe I'll change my answer now a little bit, but I still maintain the Delaware River, you're battling the Delaware River, so you'll never have enough volume. But now one part of the problem is back to the pumping situation. And I don't dispute what you're saying. It makes perfect sense. They've silted in over the years. Each of the dikes has multiple storm inlets, the discharge points from the pipes, which is where the sediment would accumulate and dump into the marsh. So if the sea level rise makes it more difficult to drain the marsh areas through those tide gates, and let's just say it's a sunny day, but the sea is still rising, and then it becomes a rainy day, you've got the rainwater now entering those marshes that don't have a place to go. That you could get enough volume by dredging to offset that potential, but not the potential if you have a nor'easter coming up or a hurricane.
Yeah, and
So yes, a benefit in a
I just
limited
see
instance.
that the silt is never gonna stop. The runoff is never gonna stop, so it's always gonna, so what's the plan to either maintain the level we're at now, or should there be a plan to clean out that air,
Yeah.
clean it out to the point where we keep up with where we're at now, not get any less depth.
Without trying.
And that might be something you need to think about.
Well, no, what I was going to suggest, and I don't know if I'm in if it's appropriate for me to be suggesting agenda items for you all, but you prompted me what you may want to do for a future meeting. I forget the gentleman's name. It might be in the echo assessment. We worked with a DENREC. DENREC actually manages, I believe you're aware, manages those dikes. Now, Mr. Bergstrom's kind of in the middle of a lot of it, if you will. Jeff's in the middle of a lot of things. But you may find it beneficial to get a better understanding how those dikes are managed. And the other thing that they look at, again, I've seen everybody's mosquito control. That I believe is what started the whole thing, and then it kind of grew into more of an ecosystem thing. But again, I'm an engineer, so I certainly understand a lot of the ecosystem aspects to it, but that's not my specialty. Somebody from DENREC.
Sorry about the outflow, we just lower the gates.
But that would drain the dike at a certain point
So
where it would affect the wildlife.
you will affect the wildlife. So the gates, there are pipes through each of the dikes that have gates on either one or both sides. It can be flap gates or the ones that go up and down. There's a whole variety of different things. So if I understood I'm sorry, what did you mean by lower the
Dredge and deep in the marsh,
right?
you were saying that it wouldn't outflow
Right.
because it's too deep in there, a lot of stagnant water, but you could lower the gates so that it would equalize.
Or keep them open longer.
Which is kind of one of the things we looked at was the whole timing of it. We tried to develop a model, and actually one of the recommendations we did make that I hope somebody sooner or later funds is to get tide gates, tide measuring devices. What's the word I'm trying to think of? Monitors, thank you. Is to start, there are monitors all up and down the river. I mean, there are thousands of them literally in the United States through, NOAA or USGS or whatever, but there are not monitors, as far as I know of, in each of the marsh areas. That I think would be something that should be relatively inexpensive. We developed, just did it in Excel. It was one of the more complex models I ever put together, where we tried to model the response time between, if you think about, you go out there at a certain time and the water levels on both sides of the dikes are going to be the same. Sooner or later, the water rises, even today, just tides that, kind of push the water into the marsh areas, and sooner or later it's a low tide, say it rains, and then it goes the opposite way. So this is what's interesting, is it can flow both ways. They got into some modeling that was just really, really difficult. But to lower the pipes, okay, say you have the marsh here and there's currently a pipe here. If you lower the marsh and lower the pipe, the problem is you're now lowering with respect to the Delaware River, and what's called head in hydraulic engineering terms. You need head to force that water through the pipe. If you have too much water elevation on the downstream side, it's not going to drain. So you may be able to lower the pipes a little bit, but if you're talking about like 2-3 feet, I don't see it. That would be tough because they're not gonna drain.
Is there some place I could find a real explanation of the operation of dikes? Because I don't really think I know enough about them, you know, how they operate and what they
Jeff
do.
Bertram would have that information.
Jeff has it. Well, again, now we're into the disclosure and, you know, not hiding anything from the public, and, you know, of course, none of us want to do that. I actually gathered the last time the Conservation District actually did it. They had a consultant come in. It's been a few years, like 2014, 2015, but they actually prepared reports for each of the tide structures, pictures, kind of engineering sense, but not, you know, it wasn't super technical. I mean, they're pretty basic structures if you think about it.
What was the organization again?
The Newcastle Conservation District funded the inspections. I'd be shocked if the reports are on their website. And again, now, you know, I'm happy to make them available. I have them. In fact, I have pretty much all these reports as well. I probably should have said that. You know, when, if, and how you want them, you know, we can certainly discuss that.
They did some major renovation to the dike gates when they put the berm in
Right.
as well, so they're pretty new, actually.
They are pretty new. Relative, well, I don't know if all of them got renovated, but they're actually in relatively decent shape. I don't think they were in danger of.
From what I read here, though, it sounds like to get them up to, well, maybe you explained this earlier, to get them up to the point where they'd have to be now for the 100-year floodplain or whatever, would be almost physically impossible because of the amount of space needed and the disruption of everything else, right? I mean, is that something that is possible? Like you said, you could put a structure, I guess, on top, but then you've got all other things going. Like, it would be ugly, number one. But
I would say it would be a very challenging design and construction problem. I did not mean to imply it would be close to impossible.
oh, okay.
It would be challenging. You've got to get environmental issues. You're probably filling wetlands. You got to get the corn. I mean, it would be years probably in design and permitting, but it may need to be done. I mean, those are the tough decisions that really are not that far down the pike.
So once this current study is complete,
Mhm.
will we have enough data to do some modeling and determine feasibility of some of the different alternatives? Or are there more studies that you see?
No, yeah, I know everybody gets, you know, let's study it and study it, and the study goes on the shelf. I'm very sensitive to that observation. So without knowing what the data being collected, I guess I kind of want to guard my response, but let's just say, and I'm sorry, we're not getting to a design level of certainly the dikes or anything. Again, that could be a
But the
monumental.
feasibility of raising versus not doing anything, or those kinds of high level questions?
Yeah, yes. So essentially, again, I overly simplistically called it the fork in the road. Really, where I'm trying to get the city is, it in some ways does boil down to those two options. Either bite the bullet and raise the dikes and fill in those gaps between them, even though it's probably going to be tens of millions of dollars and have more headaches than we can even think about tonight. Or kind of get rid, the water's going to come. I mean, I'm hearing Jeff telling me, and I think Gail, you know, even just high tides sometimes now. You know,
Do you know when the report is due from that study? The current ongoing one with the elevations?
Again, McBride and Ziegler should be done their survey work. I would hope maybe within a month. They started right before the new year, or maybe right after the new year. Again, I asked Tetra Tech for their update. They have not started yet, so it's going to take them another few months. I'd say, you know, sometime in the fall. I mean, I'll need some time, and we'll need some time, you know, gather the data and you know, do the assessment. But as I mentioned to Alice, you know, this would kind of be, okay, you have like 600 homes that are these high priorities because of potential sea level rise. 300 of them have these type of characteristics. Another 100 of them are like, and just kind of try to categorize them And the other thing, of course, is we'd have to throw some, try to estimate as best we can what kind of cost would be involved now we are talking about the floodproofing measures and what would be appropriate. At the risk, I guess, of getting maybe too far into the weeds here, it is kind of an important distinction, and I mentioned the why I did earlier, the dry floodproofing and the wet floodproofing. The current city regulation, which is totally consistent with FEMA, is you cannot, I'm sorry, if you want to get flood insurance, you can do anything you want with private property, but if you're in the FEMA program, et cetera, you cannot use dry floodproofing on a residential structure. That is only for commercial structures. Now, it is interesting, and again, this might be something you all want to look at in your off time here. There are lots of groups, environmental groups especially, that are really pushing FEMA to be updating their regulations more quickly. It's a matter of opinion. For sea level rise, we've all admitted at some point tonight the 100-year storm event comes a lot more often than every 100 years these days. Is that really reflected in their mapping? The other thing that I would think they sooner or later may need to look at is that relatively stringent, dry flood proofing in these situations, wet flood proofing, and they may need to kind of get a little bit more flexible, but that's total conjecture on my part, and that could be 20, 30 years down the pike. But Newcastle's not the only city wrestling with this right now.
Do any buildings in Newcastle have the wet floodproofing?
That's a great question. I don't know. I do know of a couple that have the dry flood proofing. One of them is at the Subway, or maybe it's the store next to the Subway, that little strip center across the street.
Very cut off?
Yeah. No, on the going in this direction, on the left-hand side, there's a series of like just 3 or 4 stores.
Sassy Nails.
But I think there's a Subway in there. It's either the Subway.
Used to be
Subway.
Subway. Now it says
Okay.
Zach's Grill, right?
Okay. So I actually have pictures of it that I took. I have actually made it to the study now that I think about it. And the other one that I can think of is that liquor store down on Route 9, kind of across the street from Mr. DeMundy's place.
There's a wall along.
If you have a, here we go. They are in here.
What page is it?
This is on page 22. I can pass that around, but these, if you look real close, you can kind of see the railings, both of these locations, which are kind of a smaller version of these logs I was talking about earlier, where again, with a flood event, you have enough days to think about it. I guess these logs are stored somewhere on site, if they can just put them in place, and theoretically, dry flood proofing, they wait for they wait out the storm, and
Well, the houses on Bull Hill that were recently put in,
okay.
they were built
Or you put a.
with
slide
very
something down
high
in there.
crawl
Oh, yeah, maybe
spaces.
some-
Okay.
So isn't that considered a type of wet? I mean, There's vents to where word can come and go, and if you'll notice, their first floor is 10 feet off the ground.
Okay, I don't have
No access to the.
firsthand knowledge of that, but I would say the chances from your description are extremely good, and knowing Jeff as I do, the floor elevation is at least a foot above elevation 9. It's at least at 10, if not higher. And they have a and this now gets way far into the weeds. FEMA will allow a crawl space in a flood area, but not a basement.
That's what they put in all the houses that have been built.
Yeah.
And some of them are 6 feet high.
Yeah.
Just the crawl space.
Yes,
Yeah.
but there's
That
no
is-
access
that
from
is
the
wet.
outside.
So you
Right.
said that is wet floodproofing.
I
They're
think
made
I
to
think it can
take
be
in water.
considered that.
So
yes.
my guess is they have
But
the
like you
vents.
say, all the first floors, living room floors, first floor, they're all 10 feet high.
Yeah.
And
If they're new construction, that this gentleman will very quickly find out probably, they have to be above that elevation.
Yeah, I didn't understand.
Okay, maybe we can take a few questions from the public, and then you all can decide sort of, do you want to meet once a month, or how do you want to handle it? And, you'll get your hard copies of this and decide, at least get some issues of what what you'd like to do at your next meeting. I think you all got the sheet with each other's contact information, is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, so, Mr. Whitehead, I believe you said.
Hi, Tom. Good to see you again. I have a question for Dave.
Uh-huh.
Now, I can tell you, not so much over here, but in Salem County,
Mhm.
where I have my business. And then I have another question. You were talking about, I agree with 100-year flood elevation, there's always 9 over there.
Mhm.
But what they would do, they were more. That elevation 9, most of the homes say in Pennsville Township, they would use the 9 as a crawl space. There were very few basements over there because you had a high flood elevation. They would make the people use the bottom of your crawl space as 9. Now, what you're saying over here, and I did many flood certificates, been a long time. They would never allow 9 as the top of the floor. Because say you have 9 at the top of the floor, your floor joist, a lot of times they'd have heaters in there,
Mhm.
they'd have ductwork. That all had to be higher than the 100-year flood. That was, they wouldn't approve anything like that. And I know a lot of municipalities over there, I agree with what they were doing.
Mhm.
They were protecting the people.
Right.
Because I'm sure, well, I'm curious to know, he was a floodplain inspector in New York and a building inspector. It wouldn't make sense. I wouldn't want a home built, say at elevation 9 or 942. I'd want freeboard under the joist.
Mhm.
And heck, we did one for, I remember Clint Ware was a good friend of mine. He was freeholder director in Salem County.
Mhm.
Years ago, he died of Lou Gehrig's disease, but that's neither here nor there. But his son built a home, must have been 3 miles from the river. Same thing there,
Mhm.
same thing there, Elsinburg Township. And his mechanical room, man, it was like some sort of vault. And but the joist underneath the house, like if they let people build at 9, that's no good because all the wood could rot.
Right.
And something else I want to mention too, before I get a little forgetful something. But years ago, when I worked with Phantom Mark and Lynch from 65 to 75, and this will work in with what Tom's saying, I agree with it. We went out where where they're doing all the development on the riverfront.
Mhm.
At one time, that was Dravo's shipyard. We went out, ran some elevations, checked the land. And this was, well, 65 to now, a time ago. Back then, we did that. They would not let them develop that because it was in the flood zone.
Mhm.
And the problem is, it's so broken. There's so many areas that have been filled in, and I agree with both of you. It killed things. It killed things. Look it up in New Jersey, the Meadowlands,
Mhm.
state land. Guess what? Like 10,000 acres were filled in when they put the football stadium. That was all state land. So the people who were regulating, a lot of times they do the most damage. How in the world did, how in the world did the, was it politics maybe? Did the, I mean, I go out there, I like, I like the riverfront, but it wasn't good enough back then, and now it's good enough.
Mr. Whitehead, you may have heard earlier that I got flooded out when I lived in upstate New York. And the main reason I got flooded, it wasn't even raining where I lived,
Right,
but because it was raining up the Susquehanna River at the
right.
top, and all of the developments had been done around
I agree with you.
the runoff couldn't be done, and it all went downstream, and that's why we flooded there.
I
So,
agree.
yeah, so I don't know exactly what we could do
I'm
about that.
one of the few surveyors in the state I know, and I'm not afraid, I say my piece. That say there's too much damn development around here, and a lot of it, they never should have built.
Yeah.
It was in
Probably
the
should-
floodplain.
Yeah, we'll have to be looking at the regulations and
It was
everything.
in the
Yeah,
Well,
floodplain.
that's one of the charges in the
Yeah,
planning
right.
commission is to look at the zoning
Right,
rules.
yeah.
And are there some that need to be amended? So
Yeah.
that's
Right.
potentially a discussion.
And around Newcastle, I'll add, and Tommy Wilson could say, there was homes put along there that never surfaced.
Well, the problem is, once they're there,
I know.
Yeah.
what are we gonna do? I mean, we can stop it.
There is
I know.
abandonment, that's part of, that's one of the,
Right,
I'm
so,
just saying,
okay.
I'm 100% with you. And Suzanne, you brought up one of the most important things this town's ever had.
well, thank you. It's gonna be a big job. Mr. Gross, I think you had something?
Yeah, two things. One, getting back to like the Bull Hill and Suzanne's statement about, having to pull together as far as building codes and different things. A few friends of mine had homes along the Jersey Shore, and basically the level that is set is below that cannot be livable or improved.
Right.
And that's, sorry. Oh,
No, I'm agreeing with you,
Oh.
in general, yeah.
yeah, so basically, as far as heating systems or anything else, bathrooms, no, it's gotta be unimproved space, and I think insurance companies are starting to look at those issues outside of what was once an area that flooded. Now they're anticipating.
Yeah.
So that they don't run into the same issues of 2013, 2014.
Yeah, insurance companies are real interesting in the face of climate change because they're looking at the, enormous.
Right.
So real briefly, the city's regulations, I'm almost positive you cannot put mechanicals have to be raised above the flood elevation. Too bad Mr. Whitehead stepped aside. The city does have the freeboard requirement, so the joists would be entirely out of the floodplain. Might have been a couple of other things in there, but frankly, you all know Jeff. He's got a great program. He really does. Newcastle's got one of the better. We haven't even talked about what's called the community rating system, which is a voluntary FEMA program. Newcastle's got one of the best scores in the state. And that's frankly Mr. Bergstrom's doings. So I encourage you to look at the regulations, but I don't think you're going to find a whole lot lacking in them, but they may need to be amended more looking
Well,
to
and
the
Mr. Bergstrom
future.
is a person you could ask to meet with you.
Right.
Sure. You have to schedule it, obviously, with
Right.
his time and all that, but he's
Yeah.
one of the people that is sort of a consultant in the same way that Mr. Athey and Mr. Lasco are, if you need them.
So
So-
I think-
How often does FEMA realign floodplains?
Remap them. They're supposed to do it, I believe, every 5 years. FEMA's underfunded like everybody. I think the current maps are 2015, if I recall correctly, so they're clearly already a year or two late. It's an enormous job. To do the whole country, it's an enormous job.
So I guess the next question is, how often do you think you want to meet, or at least when do you want to meet next? And perhaps at least some rough ideas about your agendas. I mean, this may be a good,
Well, you know what I was thinking is because we have to really have to work from a place where we all have, the basic knowledge of this report, I think. And I don't think we're to a point where we can start to do anything until we talk about, the recommendations and where we should be directing all of our attention and everything. Does everybody agree with that?
Yes,
Please
and
don't
I would
forget.
also bring in the comprehensive plan goals. in this.
Comprehensive goal, I have,
in
I've
this
made copy of
area.
that too, yeah. So for the chapter,
Okay.
yeah. So I was thinking that we could, at the next meeting, after we've all read this, and maybe we've done some extra stuff based on the things that David had with those, references at the back. We could, do whatever due diligence we wanted to as far as all that stuff goes, but at least this report, that we could then set more of an agenda for what we're gonna do in future meetings. Does that sound right?
Is
Okay.
that this one?
All right, so then I would think that, I think we
Page
could,
two, yes.
if we had a meeting in 1 month, then we can decide whether or not we need more meetings or how we want to do this. But the fourth Tuesday, this is the fourth Tuesday of the month. You can't do that?
I cannot
Not
do
the fourth?
Tuesday, but
You can't do the fourth?
No, I'm missing something I'm committed to already. for
Are
this
ya?
meeting tonight.
What does your,
Any night but the second Tuesday of the month and the fourth Tuesday. The second Tuesday.
how about the third Tuesday of the month? Does that work?
But
It doesn't have to be Tuesday, it's just that it seems
Yeah.
like most meetings are
Yeah.
Tuesdays. I don't know
You'll-
why.
That
but-
was, you'll also have to check with the city schedule, but I'm not aware of anything that meets regularly on the third Tuesday.
week is pretty open.
All right, why don't we start with the third Tuesday?
Right, which would be.
You don't have to
what?
set that in stone forever,
Right.
but at
No.
least you know when you're
We
gonna
can
meet
all-
the next
right,
time.
Right.
See-
Does
see-
everybody, I mean, just tell me if you have a different thing you want to do, but I think we need to get a basis first. Look at the recommendations that have been, that I think are really cool in here. And then next meeting, we'll sort of set our agenda for what we're going to do in the future. That's all right? Okay.
That sounds good. And
Okay.
do we need David?
Are
I mean,
you?
it's the 19th. If you're talking about April 19th, I am free that evening. It's
Are
your
you?
call.
Just a wealth of knowledge.
How
Because
often?
I would really like it if you.
I'm
could-
happy to
if you
participate
could
monthly
maybe-
or as needed. It's
Yeah,
up to you.
after we read everything and, get more of a basis,
Okay,
then maybe you could go through the recommendations with us and we could see why what has been done, and if not, why not,
Sure.
that kind of thing.
Yeah.
That'd be great.
yes, I'm
Okay.
certainly happy to.
Phil?
Two very quick things. One, in regards to, and I think Suzanne was on the advisory committee as well, as myself and a few others for Wilmapco's.
I wasn't on the committee. I went to some of the
okay.
meetings.
Oh, okay. Well, I was on the advisory committee, and one of the things that they stressed, so you might want to reach out to them, was that any alterations to, especially in this area, down to like 3 countries where it's a major problem, they're committed to doing the sewer and runoff. They were very specific in correcting any issues with that, so that issues that we know, you don't necessarily have to address it now, but as long as a committee, you factor that in, it's nothing that you have to address, but just make sure they're on point.
Right, well, since Gail Sykes is a representative to Will Mapco, she
Oh.
has contacts for that, to get that.
Well, that's
into-
one of the things I think we should do at our next meeting is specify what organizations our actions are going to affect and vice versa.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I have a executive summary, at least, of Wilmacco's sea level rise vulnerability assessment. So there's this too, and you think about all the things that are going to be affected. Transportation is a big one. Because if I was looking at this vulnerability and, if we have the highest rise, and if there's a 100-year flood, when we've got the highest rise in say 2100,
Mhm.
I won't have to worry about it, but the people here will have to worry about it because most of the roads will be impassable.
There's no way to evacuate.
And like I said, when the flooding up in upstate New York, we were not able to get out of the city for 3 days. And then after that, it took another week before we actually could take the usual routes. So they were even concerned that the bridge was going to come down because of all the debris that had come down from the river from other places. Very scary.
Okay, Mr. Garrity?
Yes, I'm a little rusty at this, but I know we're talking about flood and sea level rise, but there's another flood beside tidal flood, and that's the one that you alluded to when you lived upstate New York, and it rained somewhere else.
Right,
And we got flooded out, it had nothing to do with the ocean.
right.
And so where I live now, where I'm renting, we have a sump pump, because the plain, but the groundwater here, you go inland, I don't know how many miles, there's marshes. And so you have such a high groundwater table. The studies looking at upstream flooding, coming down, so unrelated to the ocean, except the ocean might dam it up a little bit. And groundwater affecting and cause flood problems.
Yeah, those are all excellent questions. The focus of what's been looked at thus far has really been more either, right, I shouldn't just say solely tidal. When FEMA maps their floodplains, they don't necessarily, flooding happens one of two ways, tidal or what's called riverine. You can also get flooded. It could have a hurricane hit New York State and come down the Delaware and flood you that way. I shouldn't have maybe misled otherwise. When FEMA maps the flood elevation, they don't exactly tell you why. And again, this is very, under the hood of how they do their modeling. What we've looked at, I'll say maybe kind of superficially, and I think we talked about it a couple times this evening, is that each of the marsh areas does have multiple storm pipe outfalls that drain into it. And if anybody did work on the dikes or in the marsh areas, that would have to get taken into account. And again, back to, I talked about if the elevations in the marsh areas were raised, I shouldn't have just left it with the homes could be flooded. But back to where I talked about earlier, if you have a pipe outfall, a pipe will outfall, the water will come out of it if there's nothing in its way. As soon as you start rising water on the back end of it, that's called a tailwater effect, and the water is going to go right up that pipe. And if it gets high enough, it's going to bubble up through the inlets. Excellent point. Yes, that would have to be looked at as well.
That looks at the whole Delaware, water basin or whatever it would be called, for that kind of thing, for runoffs and things like that.
Not sure how to answer that question. I mean, there are multiple, obviously, like the Corps of Engineers, has somewhat of a purview. And more of an ecological, I mentioned, this partnership with the Delaware Estuary. There is the Delaware River Basin Commission that it's headquartered in Trenton. They look at a lot of, they kind of do look at groundwater, but more from a, withdrawal for public water systems. So is there like a Uber agency that has, probably not, but there are a lot of people
looking
looking
at it anyway, really. I mean, I'd like to take down all the development on the Delaware above Newcastle, but unfortunately that's not gonna happen.
That's a bit of a challenge.
Yeah.
University of Delaware has a pretty encompassing program, because I've seen it. They can project 1 week, 10 weeks, 5 years, 30 years, what the mapping and landscape would be like.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, I think there's some UDEL links in that list that you
Yeah.
have. So, Ms. Bergmiller, can you get copies of this to everybody else within the next few days? Is that too much to ask? Okay, and then, Mr. Lesko, is it permissible for Alice to send an email saying, suggest items for the agenda to me, and then she puts the agenda together? Is that considered a FOIA?
So individual members would be communicating with you with ideas?
No, not with me, with her.
With you? As long as there's no back and forth on it,
Okay.
somebody submits an idea to you,
So if
don't
everybody-
start
I'll
responding
say right
and
now, if you
kicking
have-
ideas around.
If you have an agenda item that you think we should add, or some other information that you think it would be good to include, if you could just email me, we have an email. Right on that.
Yeah, that's part of that contact,
Yeah.
because I'm not gonna be here that,
I know.
I'm
I
gonna
know.
be away,
Yeah,
so you all,
Okay.
I'm gonna
Okay,
try to come to
now
most
that
of
you
your
said that,
meetings, but I won't be at that one.
I'm not gonna email it. However, if you
And then-
email me with
And
just
then
me,
can we
not
just send
everybody.
that to
with the
you
answer.
to get it published, the agenda?
Yes.
So once you set your date and your agenda, you can email it to Kim at the office, and she will get it published, and she needs
Okay.
it
Great.
preferably like the Friday before the meeting, so it can be public, no, Friday a week before the meeting, right? Because then she has to publish it by, if you're gonna meet on the 19th, she has to publish it by the 12th.
Do we have to go by Robert's Rules of Order or anything like that with the resolution?
That's up to you. You're the chair and you call the shot.
Okay, great,
April 19th at 7 here.
yeah.
Okay,
Do I have to notify them here at the police department too? Or?
I think the office,
Kim
Okay.
does.
All right, great, thank you. All right, I guess that's, We just say, we don't have to call for adjournment or anything like that. Okay, all right. All right, well.
Thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you.